All right. Trying to keep my word a little bit more consistently than I have in the recent past in terms of timing. I want to do what I said I was going to do at the end of the last Zoom class and say a few more things about the Bakke case and to some extent affirmative generally, but certainly generally about the idea of diversity, which of course is enshrined as a constitutionally protected purpose pursuant to the Bakke case. I have some notes here that I'll just be looking at so I don't forget what I promised. So forgive me if I glance off camera from time to time. All right. Once again, just a kind of summary point. If you're going to use racially explicit criteria in your distribution of some good or benefit, and you're not correcting or making up for some past wrong of your own, then that use of those racially explicit criteria will be inevitably subjected to strict scrutiny. All right, but unsurprisingly, here where all kinds of institutions can have affirmative action programs, college admissions, recruitment in a small organization, any kind of outreach program you can imagine. I mean, it's hard to imagine any institution which isn't recruiting or adding to its members that might not consider at some point or other having an affirmative action program. So inevitably, the question of strict scrutiny, or the question that strict scrutiny raises, plays out in wildly different ways depending on the institution or the organization that is here being subjected to it. In the religion cases, it was always the state whose law was subjected to strict scrutiny. Here, it will be, let's just make it simple for our purposes, either a college or a city procurement program. This is the Croson case, or a high school's school districting distribution plan that will be using racially explicit criteria to pursue or further its goals. And when the court subjects those plans to strict scrutiny, it's going to ask, what is the purpose? What is the goal? Is this a goal that you as this institution are permitted to have? Is this a legitimate goal? The question, are you pursuing a compelling purpose in the religion cases, really gets translated in the affirmative action cases to, are you pursuing a legitimate goal? Where legitimate means legitimate for you, given the institution or organization that you are. And of course, moving to the second part, are you pursuing it by the most narrowly tailored means? Now, in the religion cases, that was easy to understand after a while. What it meant was, could you or could you not grant an exemption to the religious group and still pursue this purpose? In the affirmative action context, it's going to mean something else. It'll mean something like, do you need to pursue this presumably legitimate goal in this particular way? Is there a way of pursuing this goal that either doesn't use racially explicit criteria? Believe it or not, that's going to come up in the Seattle case. Could you pursue what you say you're trying to pursue without using racially explicit criteria? And if you have to use these criteria, is it this particular plan, this particular program that is going to be justified? And as you know, in the Bakke case, the outcome is that the school may pursue academic diversity. That is a legitimate and so protected goal for an institution of higher learning. But it need not do so by this kind of crude set aside of identifying a certain number of seats and saying to its non-minority applicants, these seats are not in fact available for you to compete for. As many of you have pointed out, as is rather obvious, the outcome is going to be the same in terms of objective facts. I mean, nothing stops the school from achieving, let us say, a 15% minority enrollment without using the set aside. So the degree to which this really alters school admissions procedures is, I think, arguable, debatable. But as a matter of fact, schools cannot explicitly set aside a certain number of seats and say these are for minorities only. What they can do, of course, is pursue the allegedly legitimate goal of diversity, and in doing so, ask that students identify themselves racially and use that as a what you might call added criterion of merit. It's a kind of further indicia of merit to test scores and grades, and can take an applicant whose scores and grades might be lower than a non-minority applicant and rightly, legitimately make it the case that that applicant gets admissions priority. Now, I use the word allegedly because there's a lot of, commentary, and I think even a moment's reflection tells us that this is really not exactly what progressive justifications of affirmative action are about, or I'm almost tempted to say should be about. I'll make a couple of comments about this and then move on to what might, in fact, substitute instead. First, the diversity is said to be a benefit to a stimulating academic environment. That's the college's alleged justification. It adds to the richness of the classroom. But it's not ideological diversity, which you think is really what would matter if that's what you were interested in pursuing, i.e., added richness or diversity of opinion in the classroom. But as I say, identifying yourself as a libertarian or white supremacist or flat earther, telling the college admissions people, I've got views you don't hear too often. Let me sit in on those classes at Harvard and Yale. I'll really bring some diversity. That does you no good at all. Since the diversity is purely racial and the benefit is supposed to lie in educational exchange, one can wonder how sincere or disingenuous this justification really is. Secondly, the diversity is purely racial and ethnic and has nothing to do with disadvantage or history and reasons that we actually have for picking out certain groups as warranting special consideration. So, by this logic, the child of a Saudi oil baron might offer a certain kind of diversity that others wouldn't, and so should get a certain kind of break in their application. And we might overlook bad grades and scores because, after all, we haven't seen this before. And, all kinds of ethnic identities that American institutions in principle have just no interest in reaching out and helping. You can imagine there are all kinds of groups in the former Soviet Union, for example, that American colleges could quite reasonably just think, this is not really our priority to worry about how to include those groups in our American undergraduate classes or graduate classes and so forth, in a way that worrying about greater inclusion of Blacks and Latinos and others might well be. But if you're just interested in diversity, that's a hard distinction to draw. I mean, after all, bringing somebody from Georgia is going to bring a lot more diversity than one more kid from East Harlem. You'd think, well, we've certainly seen plenty of kids from East Harlem before. Haven't seen too many from Azerbaijan. Let's bring this kid in instead. And if you're really worried about diversity, you might sort of see this as, stocking your closet with all kinds of, varied and colorfully different arrayed sport coats. And that's clearly not really what the architects of affirmative action and the defenders of affirmative action wish to find themselves defending. So, it's a bit of a Trojan horse. I think that if it really were educational diversity that we were interested in, we'd be more interested in ideological diversity. we are. That's A. And B, if it were purely racial and ethnic diversity that we were interested in, and it's hard to know why we would be for educational purposes, but then in that case, yeah, I mean, shouldn't we be bringing in some ethnic Kazakh from Central Asia rather than some African American who went through a crummy school system in the Bronx? You would think if diversity was the main idea, these kinds of trade-offs would suddenly become important and interesting. But obviously, the real idea or interest is using admissions as a way of rectifying or countering, I think is a better way to put it, the vast systemic asymmetries of opportunity that people face in this nation. And here as well, I'm a bit of a, maybe not closet, bit of a Marxist. And, it seems to me obvious that affirmative action has, many justifications, but one of them is surely addressing the tremendous asymmetries in resources that you have in this country if you're white and privileged on one hand and non-white not privileged on the other. But if it's just racial diversity, then the children of the wealthy African Americans count just as much as those with access to much fewer resources. And I would think if you're in a college admissions program, you wouldn't really see it that way. You'd be very interested to reach out and help out those who had much less in the way of resources and help in high school, less tutoring, less parental wealth. And you wouldn't really be as interested in helping, the children of these NBA stars, for example, who also went to extremely helpful private schools and got all kinds of resources, as you would be in helping those who didn't have anything like this. But you can't capture that under the rubric of diversity. That's a point about opportunity and fairness and trying to rectify what is otherwise an unfair or not entirely meritocratically neutral prior arrangement. But that's not the justification Davis is allowed to have, though that is the justification that I think with some confidence assert is really motivating affirmative action admissions programs. But from the standpoint of the Bakke case, I guess there are following 3 points that really stand out, that really need to be held fast, that I will ask about. The first one is the shocker that we went through last time. Taking up rectifying systemic discrimination in America as a whole is not a legitimate purpose for this university admissions committee. Not without some, it could be, this was pointed out obliquely in one of the questions a while ago, if the California state legislature were to deputize its state university system with that project, having found that these universities are particularly well situated to pursue this legitimate state interest, and the state can certainly have an interest in rectifying past discrimination. But there too, it would be and should be state differentiated. The University of California would be, absent an act of Congress, rightly more concerned with asymmetries of opportunity by Californian minorities, experienced by Californian minorities. So as I said, the University of Texas Law School does this. They have a special program for minorities in Texas. I mean, these are the state residents. This is the state school. This is who the state can reasonably be interested in correcting the past, experience of asymmetrical educational opportunities. I very much support that kind of justification, where the state takes on the asymmetry of opportunity experienced by its own state residents across, racial and to some extent non-racial lines, and makes the rectification of those asymmetries a legitimate reason for deviating from pure meritocratic assessment in its admissions policies. But, California does not refine its admissions along those lines. It speaks only of minorities, and it is not entitled to take on the rectification of systematic discrimination in America in this way, because it in no position to determine that this is the best or the most reasonable way to handle this past history of asymmetrical opportunity. That's something for the appropriate political body, like the state legislature in Sacramento, to, deliberate about and decide. And then, absolutely, and then it could be done. So it's not as if the purpose is illegitimate. It's illegitimate for these guys, absent some further chain of endorsement, to have it. They're just a college admissions committee. This is way beyond what they can legitimately be said to be empowered to do by their charter. They cannot take up and figure out ways to address systematic political, deviations from fairness in American history. That's just sort of not what they went to medical school to figure out how to handle. But they can pursue diversity. And I've already said, I think, a fair bit about where I think this justification is a bit of a Trojan horse. It works because it's a protected interest for the college to have. But unsurprisingly, the real meaning of diversity on one hand and the real purpose of affirmative action programs on the other will come apart. They're not identical. Diversity is diversity, and rectifying past injustices or systematic asymmetries of opportunity are not going to coincide in every case. I mean, that's generally what happens. Conceptual identity. Instances aren't always the same. What a shock. So that's where we are. But nevertheless, this does remain good law. And although this justification has been challenged many, many, many times over the past almost 50 years, about 50 years. And as I say, very well financed, aggressive litigation. It does typically go all the way to the Supreme Court. It remains a protected interest, and colleges may continue to ask students to identify themselves by race and consider race as a reason to deviate from pure assessment in terms of grades and scores in the name of pursuing diversity. Obviously, as you know, what they can't do is pursue diversity with this particular set aside. That's seen in a weird use of the expression, failing to pursue this by the most narrowly tailored means. What they really mean there is it's kind of too crude, unnecessarily exclusionary. You could pursue racial diversity without excluding some seats from competition from the non-minority. You can pursue racial diversity by having everybody compete for every seat and just ask students to identify themselves by race and consider it in your admissions procedures. So the Bakke is a great victory for affirmative action. Bakke is able to get California's program as it was being practiced at that particular time found unconstitutional because of the set-aside, not because of the use of race in admissions as such. And so Bakke wins the case, but the Bakke case is without doubt a victory for affirmative action in that schools may pursue racial diversity in their classes by using racially explicit criteria, and in doing so engage in a constitutionally protected purpose. Nobody is giving a policy justification beyond the justification that the college is going to give for determining that, in its view, a more diverse classroom is a better classroom from the standpoint of educational outcome. That's the justification, and that's a protected justification. I think that's really just what I wanted to say. I don't know if I've just gone over some muddy water again and made it muddy again, or if I've cleared things up at all. I really hope I have at least said a little bit more about the ways in which diversity is, in fact, not what I think most defenders of affirmative action really are hoping to defend. I think what they're really hoping to defend has something more to do with taking into account the asymmetries of opportunity that students have to become good students and impressive students and the like. And I think affirmative action reflects a certain kind of sociological attunement to, asymmetry of educational opportunity. But the official justification now is one of pursuing diversity. We'll see. It would be interesting, and I think the time is coming where we may see a more robust defense of affirmative action policies in terms of the actual political norms that they're guided by. As I say, I think they're really guided by a certain attunement to asymmetries of opportunity rather than an interest in this kind of diverse outcome in the classroom, which, as I say, funnily enough, has nothing to do with ideological diversity, a very suspicious omission in that it's supposed to be educational value that diversity generates. And as I say, if it's merely diversity, we can't make sense of why it is, in fact, only certain groups that we're particularly interested in giving these opportunities to. We're not really interested in giving these opportunities to groups that, say, have had no experience whatsoever of asymmetries of opportunity in America. I just can't see that as a legitimate interest of the admissions committee in the University of California, Davis. I have to say, I can't see it. Then it's really, well, it would be nice, I suppose, to really worry about the asymmetries of educational opportunity that certain people have in Central Asia. But this seems to me a very different project than worrying about living up to our own commitments to fairness and equal opportunity for our own citizens and how we've fallen short and so forth and so on. At the very least, it seems to me a very different justification story, but that difference can't be captured in commitment to diversity. Well, okay, I hope I've said enough to at least, provoke some questions. So do let me know if you have any. Next time, we're taking on the Croson case and the schools case. I'll just say a little bit about Croson. It's amazing to me how little this is discussed in talk about affirmative. It is extremely important, the kind of case Croson is. Croson is a case where the city of Richmond requires any contractor who's going to bid on a city contract to have, I believe the number was 30% of that contract fulfilled by minority business enterprises. We'll get into what that means and how this works and what a contractor subcontractor is when we talk next time. But the main point is, this is money. This is just money. If you're bidding on that $1 million contract, according to the Richmond regulation, roughly $300,000 of that contract has to be performed by a minority business enterprise. And what that also means, and that's why you have to do it, and nobody denies it, and it's woven in from the start, everybody's going to have to pay a little more than they otherwise would. You're giving up this scale you get if you just stay with these big contractors. There may not be enough minority business enterprises out there that the one you find can kind of hold you up a little bit. The overall cost of the contract, when these contracts are in compliance with this rule, inevitably are a bit more than they would be otherwise. And this is not to be balked at, really. That's inevitable when you insist that some percentage be done by a certain person rather than another. You're deviating from pure blind competition. There's no guarantee that that bid, the one in which 30% is minority business, is going to be identical with the cheapest bid. Nobody expects it. It's not really what you want. That's sort of the point. It's very typical. I'm really going to start ranting, but it's just very typical of America to do it this way, to try and just kind of grow the business by paying a little more through what is, in a sense, it's kind of like a subsidy. By insisting that a certain amount be done by minority business enterprises, you're essentially saying we're going to pay that deviance from what the price would be were it purely determined by, the lowest possible bid, in order to further this political interest and goal we have. And in this case, it's not diversity. It's rectifying the past injustices of Richmond's involvement in racial discrimination in the construction industry. And, this is a city that was once the capital of the Confederacy. They have a complicated past. Now we get into complicated semi-rectification, semi-forward-looking justification story. And we also, this is going to be very important, get into the particulars of this particular set aside. Why is it 30%? Why not 20%? This can seem trivial, but to the contractor who has to find the subcontractor, it isn't. And this is, of all the cases that really should never have been litigated, this is my favorite. That these guys couldn't have figured this out and settled this, that they're in court, it's a mess. It's a disaster. They should never have been in court. But I'll say more about all this next time. I just wanted to say, in an introductory way, it is very interesting to me that affirmative action talk in this country, in the public domain, I don't think people who work in the construction industry feel this, but in the public domain, it's almost exclusively focused on admissions, and very little is said about these policies in which contractors are obligated for certain contracts to have a certain percentage of those contracts fulfilled by minorities. I think these are extremely interesting and effective affirmative action programs. I mean, money is directly going to minority subcontractors and businesses. You can't get a more effective deviation from what would otherwise happen than these kinds of policies. At the same time, you're putting the burden of compliance on the white contractor to find the minority subcontractor, which again, is just typical sort of post-Reagan, let the market do it. We're not going to do it. It's your problem. You go figure it out. You find this person, and so forth. And these cases are just never talked about. I didn't know anything about them until I started looking into affirmative action as a subject. And although there's a sense in which you're unlikely to have a conversation when you leave this class on this subject, when you talk about affirmative action, it's a great addition and an expansion of your sense of what affirmative action and affirmative action law is to read the Croson case. So we'll take that up on Wednesday evening. Do read it. It is not a victory for affirmative action. It's though I want to read the decision charitably in ways that leave open certain kinds of moves. It's not the most what's the word I want? It's at best an unhappy, but I have to say, like I say, the city of Richmond should never have been litigation on this one, on my view, unless I'm missing something. And often in a course this big, there's somebody out there who has experience in the construction industry. I've had this at least 3 times in the past, somebody who's either themselves been in the construction industry or handled the bids because they've worked for the city and been involved in the distribution of these contracts. I very much hope if there are such people out there, they'll participate in the next class. And in any event, it does, as I say, offer a very important addition to the domain of affirmative action, these set-aside contexts, and that's what we take up next time. Please do go over your Bakke notes and ask me any questions you may have. As I say, I think the crucial point is what they're not allowed to take up as a legitimate purpose and what they are.